Good evening and welcome everybody from New Zealand. Selamat pagi to those of you joining us from Indonesia, and a warm welcome wherever you're joining us from around the world to this global town hall. As you just heard, the theme of the second session is the Great Social Reset, another shot to build just, equitable and harmonious societies. And I'm very pleased and honored to be one of the co-hosts of this session today. My name is David Cappy. I'm the director of the Strategic Studies at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome from Canada. My name is Jeffrey Reeves. I'm the Vice President for Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. It's my pleasure to be here and to have a wonderful discussion this afternoon and this evening with some very esteemed panelists.
As we just heard from Maurice Payne and from a number of our previous speakers, and I think as we all know, 2020 has been a hugely challenging year around the world. The coronavirus pandemic has threatened the lives and the health of millions of people across almost every continent. It's reversed years of economic growth and thrown millions of people back into extreme poverty. And alongside this, it's also revealed, and I think exacerbated, deep issues of social inequality and discrimination that global policymakers need to be mindful of. These issues include the scapegoating and discrimination against Asian people during the pandemic. We've seen the Black Lives Matter movement emerge as a response to systemic racism, not just in the United States, but all around the world. And the pandemic hasn't seen an end to terror attacks by extremists, including those who justify their actions in the name of religion or racial superiority. And on top of that, we know that the pandemic has also had significantly gendered impacts. According to one UN agency, an estimated 31 million gender-based violence cases were reported globally in the first 6 months of COVID-19 lockdowns, and an additional 15 million cases are expected for every 3 months that lockdowns continue.
Some communities are prone to scapegoating and becoming more vulnerable during a crisis owing to their lower socioeconomic status and the deeply rooted exclusion that have resulted in their diminished access to medical care and other social services. These are the very communities that are likely to suffer oppression, regardless of whether or not there's a pandemic. The reality of social inequality and unease should alarm and move the global community to take measures to address the problem. As to the pandemic itself, either it can be seen as a temporary aberration, or it can be seized as a chance to reset the unjust social system that has been at work for centuries. Politicians, religious leaders, activists, and indeed ordinary people all have a role in a possible massive transformation process. That is the only way to build a just, equitable, and harmonious society. This session will discuss how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted efforts to promote social justice, freedom of religion, pluralism, and gender equality. It will also explore how this pandemic can be an opportunity to do a reset on social issues and come up with ideas on ways to address these issues.
So it's our very great pleasure to introduce three very distinguished speakers on this panel, presenters, all of whom are, I think, very well placed to share insights into the challenges and opportunities we face over the months and indeed the years ahead. The three are President Jose Ramos Horta, former President and Prime Minister of Timor-Leste and winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1996. Nurul Izzah Binti Anwar, member of the Malaysian Parliament for the People's Justice Party. And the Reverend Kyochi Sugino, Deputy Secretary General of Religions for Peace International.
We will first present a number of questions to all the speakers, who will take turns to answer as they see fit. After these general questions, we'll address specific questions to each panelist. The panel will conclude with a question and answer session, during which time we'll collect questions from the audience. I'll turn it over to my colleague now to ask the first question.
Thanks, Jeff. And the first question to all three of our panelists is, so you heard in those opening remarks, racial stigmatization, discrimination on religious grounds, as well as gender-based violence and discrimination are said by a whole range of different agencies and sources to have become more common this year during the pandemic. Do you think in 2020 that the world has stepped back is regressing from a path of pluralism, multiculturalism, and tolerance? And do you think the pandemic has worsened some of the social inequalities that we knew already existed? Ramaswata, I wonder if I could start with you. You're on mute. Could you unmute?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. That's great.
Started now. It's obviously nonsense. It has been going on for generations. If you look at Europe in the course of the discussions on Brexit, I met with many Africans, even prominent people in the UK from African descent, who told me the first time, and that was like 2-3 years ago when I was in the UK, they were telling me how they, Africans, high up in the politics and society in the UK, that's the first time they were abused, called up in the streets, in public. And we read these abuses, these problems all over Europe, with some countries' exceptions. Of course, exacerbated in part by COVID. And that, look, the first victims of abuse after the breakout of COVID was ethnic Chinese or anyone looking Asian, anywhere. Then in Africa, so Africans were abused in China afterwards, then Chinese were abused in Africa. So it is, COVID exacerbated that. Then we have an economic meltdown. Of course, the economic meltdown didn't, of course, exacerbated by COVID, but the signs of an economic meltdown were there 2 years ago with hyper deficits in the United States, with banks in Europe, in the United States, repeating the mistakes that led to the economic financial meltdown of 2008, 2009, and all of that. But exacerbated, obviously, by COVID-19. Now, question is, can we get out of this? Well, let me say, you know, personally, myself, with Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Prize from Bangladesh, Kailash Satyarthi, many others, we have written extensively on vaccine for poor countries to make vaccine as a common good of humanity. We have written extensively, we have appealed, we have written to G20, G7, the UN, to look at the impact of COVID and economic meltdown on the fate of children and of the poorest of the poor. And the response has been none. And I would say probably the only country that so far has come up with some compassionate and wise, forward-looking, generous initiatives have been the Prime Minister of Australia a few weeks ago. Myself and Muhammad Yunus, we wrote immediately to the Prime Minister of Australia, urging Australia as a mid-sized country within G20 and beyond to mobilize the rest of the world to really make sure that the COVID-19 vaccine is made available to particularly to third world countries, the LDCs, the fragile states. But I have not seen much of it. For instance, we have not seen debt relief initiatives. We have not seen decisions on writing off debt of the most impoverished countries, of the highly indebted countries. We have not seen reduction in Western countries, Russia, export of weapons to Middle East and elsewhere. So it looks like, you know, the old habits die hard. And unlike academics who come up with great vision for future, I'm very skeptical right now.
Thank you very much for that. Nura Isa, do you want to pick up on some of those themes? Are you seeing the same sort of departure from a tolerance, multiculturalism, an exacerbation of inequality?
Thank you, Professor David, and thank you so much. I think, Pak Ramos Horta really clearly defined the reality on the ground. I come from Malaysia, and of course, in the Malaysian context, mid-pandemic, we had a peaceful coup, which basically showcased the state of political affairs in the middle of the fear, the uncertainty of a pandemic. So it's very crucial to understand, first is the context. When you come from a multiracial, multi-religious setting, such as Malaysia, of course, you expect that there has been some degree of acceptance. We come from 3 major races. There has been some kind of symbiotic relationship all the while. But because the political scene also then is kind of showcasing or symptomatic of the concerns on the ground, such a pandemic is then being seen as sharpening existing divides. So yes, it might be in the background before, the predominantly indigenous, predominantly Malay community, which felt they were less economically or more economically impoverished when a pandemic hits. Yes, whether princes or paupers, they do get infected, but the level of which the healthcare that they are given or enjoy differs, right? So that, for me, has pushed the country and the region, of course, the global temperature to be far more racially tinged, a little bit more heightened in terms of its temperature. And it really pushes, you mentioned just now, the role of stakeholders. And this, of course, predominantly should be held holding politicians accountable, but also religious leaders. You know, in a country like Malaysia, Indonesia, religion plays an important role. So when you talk about asking the people to adopt a more nuanced, multiracial approach, you need to sort of get the different stakeholders together, and the religious leaders have to clearly be evidence-based, which is, of course, demanded in Islam. You know, you're supposed to be scientifically based. So for me, when clear-cut SOPs push the largely Muslim populace to not continue their prayers on Friday, it is relatively accepted in Malaysia. And this is important because then it sets a sense of egalitarian across the different segments and communities. And then you push people to sort of adopt clear-cut considerations and practices to manage their own and the community's safety during a pandemic. Now, moving forward, taking up also to whatever Pak Ramos Horta mentioned, I completely agree. Malaysia, you know, in my view, is a upper middle income nation. But in the COVAX, the Coalition for Vaccines, we are considered a high income nation. But a lot of the leaders across from the government as well the opposition feel the main principle in a pandemic is also to take up the responsibility. If you are managing better, then you must assist countries who are lesser off to do better, to assist them, to improve the connectivity of education to the vulnerable groups. And my fear is this great reset that we talk about during this session, which is a very important kind of vision and needs to be realized, might not take place. You talk about the new normal, but the problem is the new normal is sometimes coupled with business as usual. So first is vaccine deployment and accessibility. I think you hear about I have to mention this is a bit controversial, but you hear about all the big companies finding this the cure, but you also have key politicians, office holders making money out of their previous ownership. So I think we need to be a bit more vocal in pushing for adoption for the vulnerable segments, one, and also two is also to ensure that the reset takes place. Because in Malaysia, considering we are party to RCEP, we also have imposed a moratorium to defer payments to the bank for bank loans for a period of time. So my concern is once we sign RCEP, and the statements are wonderful, but we must ensure it doesn't become, it doesn't sort of inhibit our ability to extend assistance where we think it is needed. So the fine prints are crucial. And that's why I think, when we want to deliver forward, it has to be concrete steps. Steps 1 to 10, is it being fulfilled by respective governments? Is it being fulfilled by respective stakeholders? And are the businesses doing their bit to address the world and improve the just status of the world today?
I wonder if I could pick up on Reverend Sugino, if I could pick up on some of the points that Nurul Isa raised there. Do you see that religious leadership, religious leaders have a particular set of responsibilities in the way that they communicate information during the pandemic? Have you seen the pandemic as something that has amplified a sense of faith amongst people, or that it's fostered a greater sense of intolerance?
Thanks so much. I think I will mention that the positive side, negative side and positive side of the role of religious leaders. As you have seen globally, pandemic has fueled ethno-religious tensions through misinformation, scapegoating, hate speech, social media portraying the ethnic minority community as irresponsible in its conduct in the pandemic, or even allegations of organized spreading of violence. So instigating religious hatred was prevalent during the COVID situation. At the same time, the pandemic brought us the greater awareness of our fragility as human beings, our interdependence on one another. One research, Pew Research Center's findings, large percentage of population in the United States indicated that their faith has been strengthened during the pandemic. As more people saw the meaning of human existence, fragility, and the interdependence in our societies. And you recall, Pope Francis addressed social inequalities highlighted by the pandemic in the new encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Fraternity and Social Friendship. This encyclical is based on the document on human fraternity, signed by Grand Sheikh of Azhar, the center of Sunni Islam, and Pope Francis last year. So this new encyclical laid out the vision for the post-COVID world. The Pope said the pandemic has proven that the magic theories of market capitalism, neoliberalism, have failed, and the new type of politics that promote dialogue, solidarity, and reject war and violence is needed. So we should observe the positive side of the religious communities. Under the COVID-19 crisis, it's important to acknowledge that the world religious communities came together, partnered with intergovernmental organizations such as WHO, UNICEF, UNHCR to respond to COVID-19, working collaboratively and building multi-stakeholder partnerships to care for the most vulnerable population, overcoming misinformation and the discrimination, and addressing violence against women. So all these positive roles of religious communities should not be neglected.
Thank you. Over to you, Jeff.
I'd like to build a little bit on the discussion and focus a little bit more on the developed economies. One of the things that we've noticed is that there's been a sense of bigotry and social injustice taking place in developed countries, which to a degree suggests a lack of causality or relationship between economic development on the one hand and social stability and inclusivity on the other, at least in some instances. I would like to ask the panelists, what are your thoughts about this? If in the past we thought as a society and as an economy becomes more developed, it will lead to more internal stability, but we've seen the pandemic actually lay this assumption bare for being incorrect in some instances. What are your thoughts? And again, I'd like to start with perhaps backwards this time, start with the Reverend Sugino and see what your thoughts are specifically around this issue.
Thank you so much. In developed countries, there seems to be a clear correlation between the growing inequality and the rise of anti-immigrant nationalist populist forces. And the liberal democracy suffers from an erosion of trust in the institution and the actors that have the mandate to represent the will of the people. The populist surge is a reflection of the declining trust and the confidence that the citizens have in traditional forms of representative democracy. So extreme forms of nationalism, authoritarian leanings, and aversion towards ethno-cultural other are observed in many Western liberal democracies. And faced with the limitations of liberal democracy and the challenges of cultural and civilizational divisions, the human family needs to develop ways to nurture responses and find solutions based on shared values, such as fraternity, dialogue, solidarity, and shared well-being. And one example, that the demonstration of such challenge and also effort to find solutions based on shared values in response to recent events in France and elsewhere. Religions of Peace, our organization, World Council, representing Grand Sheikh of Azhar and all major religious traditions of the world, came together to issue a statement. And the statement said, there is no doubt that the Muslims, whether they reside in France or elsewhere across the world, experience hurt when their prophet is seemingly insulted. However, it does not justify breaking the various principles laid down in Islam and in every phase to prevent atrocities. So it is our obligation as faith leaders to model responses that are dignified, humane, merciful, rather than vengeful. Freedom of speech is a human right, without doubt. It is also liberty that requires civility. So hand in hand with the freedom of speech comes a shared value of honoring the dignity of all human beings. Words are powerful and should foster respect and cohesion in society rather than intensify divides. So we are living in an imperfect world, and we will continue to face challenges and struggles. However, as expressed in the document on human fraternity and fratelli tutti, we need to continue our efforts to build value-based institutions, nurture human interactions, and find solutions based upon fraternity, dialogue, solidarity, and shared well-being.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Nuraliza, I wonder if you could pick up on some of these points and maybe address where did these tensions come from within the developing world and developing economies with respect to the pandemic and some of the instances of injustice that we're seeing play out in these developed economies?
Thank you, Dr. Jeffrey. I actually loved what Reverend Koyuichi mentioned. It's so true. It reminds me a lot of the basic tenet in Islam, karamah insaniya, the dignity of man. So while we must respect freedom of expression, there's also a degree of sacredness, which is held to by many religions. And I think through the pandemic, you kind of see sometimes leaders or whether communities or whether other stakeholders, they cross that barrier, whether giving in to vengeful or anger or resentment. And it really provides us with an opportunity to take stock of what's happening and, basically rise to the occasion to do what's right. I would say this. In the particular circumstances which Malaysia faced, we have a relatively robust healthcare system, for one thing, but I see the different clusters that developed. The first, it was the Tabligh in a relatively Muslim religious clerics cluster. And then there was the Sivaganga cluster, some who visited India and came back with a quite infectious strain of COVID-19. And the third one was the prison cluster. In each of these cases, it really helps bring home further awareness of the plight faced by different communities. So the non-Malay community, the non-Muslim then saw, well, how closely knit the Tabligh cluster was, but it didn't mean that it was to be blamed for that. Everyone then came to the fore and used it as the opportunity to whether apologize for coming out together in groups. The prisoners who are always behind bars, people generally don't want to talk about the plight of prisoners, but when the cluster emerged and it became a huge problem, thousands were infected, including the lives of the wardens in prison, the whole spectre of the need to implement prison reforms then were taken seriously from legislators. So yes, it is a terrible situation. I think, when you talk about even killing in whoever's name, it could be, your own beliefs, but any sort of killing, murder, you must condemn it unequivocally. That's quite crucial. But by the same token, in a Malaysian context, I think there's a lot of push and drive to have a degree of respect for the religious spaces of different adherents of the faith. So I think we have to find a balance, especially at this opportune time, not to give in to our jingoistic extreme elements as a pushback, but really take stock of what works to sort of unite the different segments together. I know it's easier said than done. Usually, you feel that these things, it's just, it could just be starting with a pronouncement from leaders, but I think it goes a long way. So I come from a multiracial party, and it's been very challenging, of course, sometimes when the scenario is very much in favor of racially based organizations. But I think you must never take for granted the impact it will have across the different groups and communities. So yes, I'm not going to be in denial. The world has become far more polarized. And this is also due by the different leaderships that have taken control in different segments of the world. But it also provides us with the opportunity to push back and present that the future lies in bridging gaps.
Much. President Ramos Horta, I wonder if I could hear your thoughts on this question as well, but perhaps add one more point. How do we ensure that economic growth in developing countries is inclusive? And maybe we need to rethink the idea of a gross domestic product and replace it with something else that measures how the economy is equitable with respect to developing economies to address some of these issues. And I wonder what your thoughts are with respect to some of those.
Sure. Well, as we know, in 2000, the United Nations launched the Global Sustainable Goals. Then in 2015, the Global Development Goals. And then in 2015, the Global Sustainable Goals. And in the meantime, all of these, first was impacted by the 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011 financial crisis. You recall, prior to that, most Western countries, OECD countries, pledged to increase ODA as relation to their GDP, some to at least 0.7, as against Norway, Sweden, Finland, that were the five countries in Europe, that the only ones that always met 0.7 and above, up to 1%. So then we heard Spain, Portugal, a few other countries in Europe, United States, Japan going to increase. Well, after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, everybody went down. So there was a severe reduction in ODA. And we know ODA was never really, the ODA never really directly benefited the poorest in the recipient country, in the community. And it was not always the fault the host countries. It was both ways. So now we have an even bigger problem. We have a 20-year setback, 10-year, 20-year setback because of current pandemic and the global recession. So this requires a far greater visionary leadership, but of the powers that be, of the United States, of Europe, of China, of India, of Japan, South Korea, countries grouped in the G20, G7 and G20. But I don't see much of that. Look what's happening in the United States. Whether we like it or not, it's still the power of the world. And when the President of the United States is the first to undermine the multilateral system, beginning with the UN and its agencies, the alliance with Europe, and even with its closest neighbor, Canada. So where are we going to find inspiration, leadership to tackle these catastrophic consequences of this global pandemic and global recession? I'm very afraid my friends and brothers in Europe, who over the years, last few years, as a result of the war in Syria and the drought and extreme poverty in North Africa and elsewhere, they end up with several million refugees at their doorsteps. Germany under Merkel was the most magnanimous and visionary to have welcomed overnight 2 million Syrian refugees. Now there are 3 million at least in Turkey, on the gates of Europe. So if we don't address the current situation caused by the pandemic, how many more people are going to have to leave their homes? And of course, destabilize socially the countries they're going to. It will increase the tensions. So I'm pessimistic, because it's great to say about declarations, we can make all great pronouncements, but in the end, it is G7, G20, and others that have to make the decisions. In the end, it will be the big banks. I have not seen any big bank announcing that a summit of big banks, we are going to write off the debt of the poorest countries. I have not seen the richest companies in the world, having a summit of their own. Let's make bold decisions to help the world economy. I have not seen a summit of the biggest foundations of the world. So that's where we are in this miserable situation.
Thank you, President Ramos Horta, even if it was a slightly grim conclusion. I wonder if I could put a couple of quick questions to Nurul Izzah, because I know that your time is a little bit limited. You're obviously well known as a staunch advocate of promoting gender equality. What are some of the biggest roadblocks that you've faced in that work? And how do you think the pandemic has affected gender equality in Malaysia and across Southeast Asia?
I think, Professor David, you mentioned it earlier. You're talking about millions of cases increasing in the span of the pandemic, gender-based violence. Similarly, in Malaysia, the same is happening, is taking place. And the problem is the way we look at the Ministry of Women and its role. My push and a lot of my other colleagues, we have been asking that the Ministry of Women, Family and Community Empowerment be frontline. Why is it not a frontline ministry in a pandemic? You know, the plight of the vulnerable, the plight of refugees, the plight of women, the plight of children. This really factors in as the most crucial element, not defense procurement. So it really has been a struggle uphill because, like it or not, even though in Malaysia there are the basket of the food baskets, the Ministry of Women is responsible for one. Yes.
If we've just lost Nurul Isa, if you can hear me, perhaps if you could just turn your video off, and that might improve the quality of the signal. If you're there. But if you're not, I fear we may have lost Nurul Isa. Jeff, I wonder if I could get you just to move on to one of the other directed questions. And
Absolutely.
if Isa comes back, we'll go back to her.
Sounds good. Oh, okay. I thought we just got her back, but it looks like maybe she's fallen off. Reverend Sugino, I wonder if you wouldn't mind fielding a question. Why do you think that despite the advocacy to respect religious freedom and interreligious tolerance at a very high level, at a top-down level, at the grassroots we still see many bigotries on a daily basis? More pointedly, can we achieve religious tolerance without mutual respect between interreligious groups, in your opinion?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just one thing in response to President Hotta's comments. I think religious communities are working on the debt cancellation effort, and the advocacy for the G20 has been underway, and there are some small but significant achievements through the advocacy, global civil society advocacy, that the G20 nations agreed to freeze debt repayments for countries at least until June 2021. And the China, largest bilateral creditor, joined in that commitment. So I think it's a small step, but it's an important step, and the religious community should continue to advocate for debt cancellation. And on that question, it's an important question, from the misuse of religion in instigating violence to ordinary people's misperception, prejudice, and the stereotyping. Of course, we need top-down and bottom-up approaches, but what is actually required is a multi-layered and multi-dimensional and multi-stakeholder approach.
Amelia.
So Religions of Peace has worked with religious communities worldwide to build the civil society multi-religious mechanisms. Just to give you one example, very important example, the Interreligious Council of Sierra Leone served as an official observer to the peace process, negotiating for the release of child hostages and eventually ending the war. And that same civil society multi-religious mechanism worked to respond to HIV/AIDS and the Ebola crisis in partnership with UNICEF and others. Based on those experiences, the Interreligious Council of Sierra Leone is currently working with Ministry of Health, WHO, and the UNICEF to disseminate public health information, training local trainers, and to prevent misinformation and discrimination related to COVID. So it's important that once a habit of collaboration among different faith communities is nurtured, then that such multi-religious mechanisms can work in times of peace in times of conflict and in times of humanitarian emergencies.
Hi, I'm so sorry I got cut off earlier.
Welcome back.
Sorry, Prof. David. I want to, so clearly, you know, when we're talking about even educational continuity, even a member of parliament has issues with the internet. Can you imagine if there was a student in the far-flung out rural areas? How will they have kind of deep connectivity so that they don't have a lost year following the pandemic? So for me, if you don't mind, I would like to just address a few key things which I think are doable. The first, Malaysia has just taken a move a couple of months ago to revise our poverty line. So from 500,000 recipients, you have 1.5 million recipients. And I think that's important because in a pandemic, people are going to be worse off, right? You can't rest on your laurels and think the current benchmarking, like President Ramos Horta mentioned, is acceptable. People are going to be worse off. The World Bank, the gains that were made in 2017, everything has been wiped out with regards to eradicating poverty. So revising the poverty line income, and I think not just financially worse off. So having these mechanisms of measurement to make sure you have a more concrete measure and kind of the depiction of what people are facing is important in a post-COVID era. Number two, broadening social security. Malaysia, for our workers, only 55% don't have social security protection. They're not part of the employees' provident fund. So I can see that this is also reminding governments not just to subsidize payments per month, but actually looking at how to broaden social security for gig and independent workers. And of course, the final point, as I said, women's ministry, you want to take care of women, you want to take care of gender-based violence, make it a frontline ministry. So I think this is done, this is doable. It's small steps, but when you shift the conversation, then eventually we'll get lucky enough to make sure the banks pay for what they should be paying. Thank you. I'm so sorry I have to leave now.
Not at all, Nura Izzat. Thanks so much for being so generous with your time today. Those were fantastic contributions, and we're very grateful to have you.
I'm so blessed to be part of this panelist. We're having the first step to change the world, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you very much. I wonder if we could turn to the Q&A and put some questions from our global town hall audience to the participants. And I've got a first question here from Bella Maria in Indonesia, and it's to President Ramos Horta. And she says, seeing how there are many economic meltdowns and there's so much social upheaval during the pandemic across the globe, how do you picture us as a global community surviving this tangle? And I wonder if I could maybe just think about that in the context of, we've seen so many countries around the world turn inward and focus about national responses over the pandemic. How do we build a sense of global solidarity to respond to these kind of challenges? You're on mute, President Ramos Horta. That's it, great.
Okay. Sorry. Well, you know, look at even ASEAN. ASEAN is one of the most effective, credible regional organizations. And yet, I might be wrong, I have not seen ASEAN joint initiative in tackling COVID. Even the European Union, it took them time, really many months, after so much outcry and painful criticism from people in Italy, before the Europeans came with a package for the research on the vaccine and for economic recovery. I have not seen anything continental-wise in Africa, continental-wide. I have not seen anything in Latin America. So it's obvious that each country had to find its way to deal with the COVID. Of course, in our case, Timor-Leste, we have been very fortunate that we have a great neighbor, Australia, with resources. We were lucky, fortunate that we didn't have a massive importation of coronavirus. Right now we are free for coronavirus. We have had few cases many months ago, all mild cases. We have had tremendous support from WHO, the UN system, from Australia, from China, from Japan. So some neighbors, some friends in the world, the UN system have come to our support. And I know across the world in Africa, the UN is doing its best. And but I have to say also that since 2017, with the election of President Donald Trump, there has been really hostility or indifference or undermining the multilateral system. And not only the UN, the transatlantic relations, and NATO, and all the institutions, not to mention international law, other international institutions. So there is we are going to face, fortunately, there is a new president of the United States, Joseph Biden, who is a very decent person, extremely experienced, dedicated to international partnership. So we have a chance that the United States will be able to work again with the United Nations, with the European Union, with China, India, Japan, Korea, within G20, G7, to assist us. Otherwise, obviously, each country has to fend for itself. And to the extent you can, some of your richer neighbors, like Australia, is doing with the initiative of Prime Minister of Australia announcing the $500 million to support to ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, the Pacific countries, including Timor-Leste.
We have many questions, but only, unfortunately, time for one. And I'm going to take, unfortunately, demonstrate my inefficiency as a moderator and ask you, Reverend Sugino, a very difficult question, and at the same time ask you to give us a very concise answer. How can religious leaders promote public health measures? They can often be contravened by often extremist religious leaders. So specifically, how can religious leaders help promote public health measures that might then become a bit controversial within the religious community?
So that my answer has to be short. The role of religious leaders are twofold. One is normative, and another is pastoral. And the normative, I think that the sharing the values and the principles with the followers, that's an important task. And pastoral work, we have to educate and followers about the important aspect of religious traditions and the key principles. So those initiatives, even before the COVID or under COVID, that the role of religious leaders will continue to prevent extremism and positively contribute to the public health crisis. So those things should continue with the normative and the pastoral role of religious leaders and communities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Sugino. We could, I think, talk about these issues for another hour if we had time, but unfortunately we're out of time, and that brings us to the end of this second session of Global Town Hall 2020. On behalf of my co-host Jeff Reeves from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, I'd like to thank our three wonderful panelists today, President Jose Ramos Horta, the Reverend Kyochi Sugino, and Nurul Izzah Binti Anwar. I think you'll agree they've provided just really terrific insights. And on behalf of Jeff, I know we'd also like to thank Dino Patijalal and the foreign policy community of Indonesia for inviting us to be a part of this event. It's been an absolute pleasure. Farewell from us, and we'll hand you back to the MC and on to the rest of the program. Thank you.